touch with Rahul, and somehow things clicked, and Rahul consented also. So it is a rare occasion that we are hearing Rahul. And the reason that I'm starting in the beginning is that I head the education committee of SONA. There are many committees, and the main function of the education committee is to look after architectural education part, and then exhibition, architectural exhibition, and then architectural talk. These are the main areas that we are focused in. And the committee consists of vice chairman of the SONA, Bauram Bhattrai, and then Archana Wade, she is in the screen, and then Deepak, um, he's also in the screen. So three of us, and then beyond that, most of the head of departments of all the private colleges, they have also contributed. So with their help, we are trying to do something beneficial for our society. Uh, it is really rare occasion for me, because I happen to be alumnus of Harvard, where uh, Rahul belongs to and Bires belongs to. So it was really nice that uh, we are listening to Rahul for his enormous works that he has done. So having said that, let me pass over to Bires to continue it, to moderate the session.
Well, good morning to Rahul and good evening to rest of us. Uh, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Rahul Mehrotra. Rahul is an old friend, and I remember my first meeting with him almost 30 years ago. I was giving a talk on Kathmandu in Cambridge, at the MIT campus, and he, who was doing his thesis at Harvard, had come to attend it. That's where we met first time, and so it's a really special, very special for me to welcome him here, in to an audience in Kathmandu for a talk from his university, and so it's a really nice to find that this whole lecture worked out, and we look forward to it. Rahul, is a internationally renowned practicing architect as well as academician, and he needs no introduction. Nonetheless, I have to. I would like to make a short introduction about him before we proceed further with the lecture. So, Rahul Mehrotra is the founder principal of RMA Architects. He divides his time between working in Mumbai and Boston and teaching at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, where he is Professor of Urban Design and Planning and the John T. Dunlop Professor in Housing and Urbanization. Rahul also is the chair of the department, incidentally, and this is, I believe, his second term as chair of the department. He has previously also been professor at MIT and at University of Michigan before this. He has authored a number of books on Bombay, the city, on the architecture of India post liberalization in the 90s. And his most recent book is entitled Working in Mumbai. Is a reflection on his practice evolved through his association with the city of Bombay. And I think, his talk is, largely based around this new book that, he has written, published. And I think, here is going to reflect on the 30 years of practicing in India and outside India from his office in Mumbai, RMA, Rahul Mehrotra Associates. And I think, we look forward to this sort of, in reflection on his 3 decades of practice in this talk. And over to you, Rahul.
Thank you very much, Biresh. Let me just share my screen and then we'll get going. Uh, yeah, so you can see, yeah, it's all good.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Uh, so Biresh, you have my cell phone number. Just
Yeah.
text if something goes wrong in the connection and all
Yes.
of that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. But thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Sharma. Thank you, Biresh. Thank you, all of you at SONA for initiating and organizing this. It's actually an honor and a pleasure. So no question of my consenting. As Bharat Sharma said, it's in fact an honor, and thank you very much for being invited. I wish we could have been in Kathmandu and spent more time together besides the lecture and got to know each other. But such is the world, and hopefully it will happen in the future. So I'm going to, start, as Biresh said, working in Mumbai. I would call this lecture working in Mumbai. I'm not going to make it strictly about the book. I will end with telling you a little bit about the book. But I think what I'm doing is extracting from it some parts, which are all, everything that you're going to hear is in the book, but in different forms. But I'm kind of going to narrate them as my own experiences, which I feel it would resonate anywhere in South Asia, because I think in many ways culturally we have lots of affinities which our political boundaries have uh, stopped us from exchanging in more easily. And so I think experiences from India, experiences from Mumbai, I'm sure resonate in different ways. Of course, each city is quite different. But I mean, I think what characterizes all our cities is, and our urban condition largely, is this question of inequity. And inequity plays itself on the ground like this. It it inverses many readings of the city. And so I would argue what you see here, you could call the formal and the informal city. But I would argue also that a lot of people who are living in what you're calling the informal city are people who are also actually participating in the formal economy. And people you think who are living in the formal city are often participating in the informal economy. And so I think meaning shifts, meaning in architecture is always not as clearly mapped on as we see in many Western paradigms. And I think this becomes a real challenge for us. And of course, we see these inequities in our real everyday experiences, where different worlds sort of exist so much simultaneously. This is an emblematic image. It's an image from one of our projects, which I'm going to show you. But it's an image that actually an intern took. It wasn't even a professional photographer. And these are gardeners who are working on the facade of a building, and their bosses are sitting inside, and they're making eye contact there. And I'll talk about all of this in the project. But I just want to quote Marty Chen. Marty Chen is, I think, one of the world's authorities. She's at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and she wrote something on economy which struck me. And when I looked at this image, and what she said is, what is needed most fundamentally, especially in our context, is a new economic paradigm, a model of a hybrid economy that embraces the traditional and the modern, the small and the big scale, the informal and the formal. What is needed is an economic model that allows the smallest units and the least powerful workers to operate alongside the largest units and the most powerful economic players. And I think this is the big challenge, because this is where I think design, which has this incredible power of synthesis, can resolve forces and differences like this. And so the notion of the context is something that we, I think, engage with all the time as architects, and we define the context as, the site, the materiality, the climate, the way the sun moves, the air, the temperatures. Some of us are more, let's say, ambitious, and we look at the embedded histories in a context and begin to discern even the intangibles. And those make, of course, and nourish design much more intensely. But I think we have to be even more ambitious than that. And what we have to say is that every context we work in sits in an other context. And that larger context is a context of political, social, economic changes. It's about global forces. It's about notions of aesthetic. It's about many, many other things which are far more intangible, much more in flux. And I think we have to charge ourselves as architects in places like South Asia to go beyond and nestle our context, the context that we operate on a daily basis for our practices in this broader context. We can't avoid doing that. And this is where research, where the academy, the linkage between the academy and the practice and the professionals becomes very, very critical. And this is an ambition that I urge us all to kind of engage with. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is I'm going to share with you for the next 10, 12 minutes, some research work, some observations, and then I'm going to show you 4 or 5 projects. Not that I'm going to say this is how I responded to this, but just to contextualize it in a sense. And so the first question then I think becomes, how do we look at these binaries? You know, we've become very, I think, lazy in a way that we organize the world, and it's very useful to do that through these binaries, right? We say the formal, the informal, state, the
Hello?
private. Hello? Hello? Biresh?
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Okay.
Go
So
ahead.
then, yeah. Okay. So we then look at these binaries and we organize the world around these binaries. But is it useful to do that? Because actually, what we do by saying this is the informal city and that's the formal city, we actually create a polarity. We don't create a synthesis. So we have to go beyond these binaries in our design imaginations, I believe. And so for me, the formulation of the formal and the informal, I instead use the word kinetic. I call the cities in South Asia kinetic cities. These are cities where architecture is not the single spectacle of the city. These are cities that continually form and reform. They form incrementally. This is what I call the 5 stages of squatting, where this guy is in the 3rd stage of squatting. Our whole city is made by these motions, and this guy might be here, you know, for 2 years and then move on because there are new rules. The police do something, he can't bribe the police any longer. There are just so many dynamics. But our city is made by these sort of incremental moves, or this game of cricket in the Maidans in Mumbai, where it's used for cricket during the day, and then in the evenings it becomes a venue for a wedding. And you see the cricket pitch is sacred, so nobody touches it. But the wedding wraps around the club, and the club members and the cricketers both have tea from the same kitchen and samosas and all of that. And in the morning it goes back to cricket. So it's temporal, it's elastic. The same thing happens with streets during the Ganesh festival. Ordinary street in Mumbai, it becomes a community center for 10 days. Plaster of Paris, cloth. 5,000 people can watch a film here. They can have meals together. They worship the Lord Ganesh. And then after 10 days, when the immersion happens, this goes away. The street comes back to normal. In fact, immersion on the last day when the Ganesh statues, 300-400 of them in Mumbai, and thousands of smaller ones that are at the level of the family are immersed, the spectacle comes to a close. As the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. It's an enacted moment, but it is a spectacle. These are the spectacles by which the image of the city is defined, and they're temporal moments. So it's not just architecture, but it's all these sorts of festivals and the gathering of human beings in space through movement. And there's Tazia for the Muslims, there is Ganesh, Navratri, Dasera. I mean, one can name, I think something like 100 festivals that happen at different scales, which are the real spectacles of the city. It's not architecture, but architecture becomes the background. And this is a question of synthesis. It's not just architecture, and architecture assumes different meanings when it's used as a different background. This is very different from the Western paradigm, where architecture is the central spectacle of the city. And this kind of brittle form, I call this the architecture and urban landscapes of impatient capital, because capital by its nature is impatient. It must realize its value very quickly. And so all the territories where the friction for the arrival of capital is minimal, Dubai, Shanghai, Abu Dhabi, these have become the new places because capital is all going there, and it's manifesting itself as architecture in very, very brittle form. This is form that's driven by vendors. I mean, architects desperately twist and turn their buildings to make them look different. But essentially, it's the economics and the logistics of manufacturing and dry construction which allows speed that makes these architectures. So this is the architecture of impatient capital. And I think what we engage with in South Asia is quite different. Architecture has a different role. It's one of the many instruments by which a city is imagined and made. And it's one of many instruments that define the image of the city in terms of it being a spectacle, versus where architecture is a single instrument by which cities are made and defined. When I say architecture, by extension, of course, I mean urban design and planning and all of that, where that becomes a spectacle. So this is what drew me to study the Kumbh Mela, because one said that if one has this theory about the kinetic city, what happens when it plays out at the level of a mega city? And we call this project mapping the ephemeral mega city. And we, look, you all know the Kumbh Mela, the confluence of the Ganga and the Yamuna, when the waters recede in about 8 weeks, a city to house 7 million people is built with like 100 million people visiting it. And this is a lecture in itself, and I won't get into. We've done a book, and I'm happy to, if your institute is interested in the future, to do a lecture just on the Kumbh Mela, because there's a lot to learn. But let me just show you how the before and after. That's an image I took on the top, which is like in October, just when the monsoon had finished and the clouds were receding and the water was going to dry up. And the image at the bottom is from the same spot on the 14th of January on Makar Sankranti, where the whole city had sort of emerged. And here, every road in the city, it's all on the sandbank. So it's the lightest megacity in the world. And every street goes across as a pontoon bridge, which means it's the most robust urban system, not unlike, most of our cities have one or two or three or five bridges across a river when they span a river. But here, every street goes across as a bridge. So you can imagine the resilience of it. And then what's built is very light on the sandbanks. Even the roads are just merely plates. The components of habitation are very light. And so I just want to share with you two learnings which are interesting. One is that everything that you see here, what you see above ground, is made out of just 5 materials. It's really a kit of parts. And those 5 materials are bamboo, rope, string, screws or nails, and some skinning material, which could be canvas or cloth or textile. And that ramps up. That 8-foot bamboo is what you see in red, but that ramps up completely in different scales. And it's amazing. That's how it can be assembled so quickly and disassembled so quickly. It's systemic thinking. It's a kit of parts, so to speak. The other thing I want to share with you is that even the governance structure, this is a mapping of the governance structure, is on a temporal basis. So the chief minister starts a year before the festival, but every month the path structure changes till eventually at the bottom you see the Mela Adhikari. He is in charge and he reports to very few people, but the whole hierarchy flips. Now, actually, in many of our cities around the world, the governance structures are actually more permanent and more ancient than actually sometimes even the buildings. And so our systems don't then respond now to climate change related crises or flux of people, because those systems aren't set up to do that. But here, this whole system is set where, depending on the stage, depending on the crisis, the hierarchy actually shifts across the circle, which is absolutely amazing. So temporality is not just a question of reversibility of urban form or using temporary materials or using a kit of parts, but it also seeps into even the governance imagination. And that's why, on the last day when the Mela is over, within 2 weeks, this is what is left, and then it disappears, leaving no memory, and you're back to that. We extended this research into saying, okay, the Kumbh Mela, but what can we learn from other such phenomena? And we looked at what I call ephemeral urbanism taxonomies, which is, transaction, which is markets, many markets. The image you see here is a market in Mexico that happens, or markets in Mexico City that happen on the weekends, that employ 50,000 vendors, and they use all the parking lots, because on the weekend, the parking lots are not used in downtowns and things. It becomes a market. And of course, for religion, there are hundreds of examples. For strife, which means earthquakes and things. For extractions, mining towns, celebration, refuge, refugees, military. These are all part of that taxonomy we built, and it's became a book also. And the book is called Does Permanence Matter? it's ephemeral urbanism. Of course, it's a provocation because we did this for the Venice Biennale and it was an architectural biennale, but it's a provocation saying that why as architects are we so fixated on the notion of permanence, and what does permanence really mean? And if we actually use temporality, which means if we can embed the notion of time, material life cycles, and we can create more innovation through reversibility, maybe we'll touch the planet much more lightly. So these are the kinds of research, among many other things that Biresh alluded to, which is specific to Mumbai, that became very interesting for me. And I've just shared with you, and these are all in the book, and I've just shared with you a little sliver of it. But I've shared this to just put this point up, which is that, everything I've shared with you so far is my sphere of concern. But therefore, then often my sphere of influence and my sphere of concern don't intersect. And this is the frustration we all feel as architects, because our concerns are becoming bigger every day, climate change, injustice, poverty. I mean, we are part of all those conversations, but then we get up in the morning and go to our office and, we are doing an addition to a house, or we're doing someone's fancy weekend house. And we have no agency actually, because our sphere of concern and sphere of influence don't really match. And this is, I think, the gap that we have to desperately find ways to close. And I think the academy can play a big role. I think institutions like yours can play a big role, and research and all of us engaging in these questions and these conversations that we're having as I speak now become very important. And so I think really we have talked always about the architect. We have always talked about the practice of architecture. We not need to talk about the architecture of practice, which means even the structure of how we practice must change to include some of these arrangements. If we look at even in South Asia, but this might be even global, we have one end of the spectrum at the bottom. You see, we have boutique homes and private individuals, architecture, what I call the architecture of indulgence. And these are resorts and hotels and all of that. It's about 1% of what makes the built environment at the most. And on the top, what we have is we have advocacy practices, NGOs, self-initiated things, research, alternate practices for foundations. All that makes us feel very good, and we all do this. I'm part of this. I mean, this is a self-reflection, which is what Viresh described, which is what I've done in this book. This is a self-reflection about also being critical of what we see and we do. What we avoid most often is the mainstream, which is builders and corporations and developers and government and faith-based practices, the millions of new temples that are being built, and institutions. Of course, we all do that, but we find those as the most painful. We say, my God, you had to compromise because a developer wanted to make money, or the government bureaucracy was so bad I couldn't do a good building. So we have many excuses for that. But that is the mainstream, and that is what makes 90% of the built environment. And if that is something we can't change, then I don't think we're going to have agency as architects. And so I think we have to give much more visibility to good practices in the mainstream, to cultivate and to encourage other practices in the mainstream, because advocacy or boutique homes is easy compared to the mainstream. And if we don't change the mainstream, we can't. If you look at magazines concentrate on the top two. They celebrate. I mean, most magazines you pick up, at least in India, it's full of weekend homes, boutique homes, some resorts, some fancy interior. No one takes on a project which you did for the government because they feel, oh my God, it didn't really finish well, or whatever. I mean, it's beginning to happen, but I think we need to put much more attention to that. And then from that, what I learned, and this is the last observation before I jump into projects, which will be more fun, I hope, is we also haven't found ways of nuancing our understanding of what the client is. So we say client, we had a client, but actually, if you think about it, and I've learned this now in reflection on my own practices, is a client is made up of, I mean, to simplify, it's three components. You have a patron client, someone who patronizes the project, often is a person who pays for the project. And then you have what you call maybe the operational client, which is the client who actually makes it all happen and it gets built. And then you have the user client. Now, we can be even more ambitious and we can say the city is my client, I'm responsible for the planet, I'm responsible for the universe. So your spheres of concern and therefore related to that responsibilities can expand exponentially. But let's keep it somewhat simple because we're complicating it anyway. And let's say the patron, the operational client, and the user client. Now, so in a single family house, what happens is these three collapse and it becomes one. Because except for some complications between a couple you're building for, it's really an entity. They're the ones who make it operational, they pay for it, and they use it, right? And that's why we love to go there, because it's frictionless, right? We complain, my God, that husband and wife or those partners just couldn't get along well, so I compromised and I had to do this. But like that's nothing compared to, let's say, a campus where the president of the university is the patron client, and might appoint you, or the campus engineer is the operational client who might appoint you, and the users are the student and faculty. Now, these are completely different worlds, you know. And then the architect's role becomes how do you weave their aspirations together? So it gets even more complicated. At least they might speak to each other. You go to most government projects, the patron, the operational client, which might be the public works department, and the users, which might be, you know, economically marginalized people. It might be ethnic minorities who sometimes don't even have access to the government. So the constituencies which make the client don't even speak to each other. And then the architect's agency and role becomes even more expanded. So we have to recognize this if we have to be effective. We often don't recognize this and then attribute our failures to the fact the client wasn't good. But the point is we didn't understand the client. And I think this is a challenge that we need to face and place for ourselves. And I think institutes like SONA, Indian Institute of Architects, Council of Architects, I mean, I think these institutions must play a bigger role in popularizing and putting these challenges forward. So with that, I'm going to now jump into projects and just try to show you how one has responded within this broader understanding to some of these things. And I'm happy to make the connections when we discuss things. Yeah. Mumbai, the city that I work in, the metropolitan area, a lot of people build weekend homes in this hinterland, which has become very popular because here people can't really afford houses. So they have small apartments, but they have a lot of money. So they go out and play their urban fantasies out in the hinterland. When I say urban fantasies, build that bungalow, that they would, have liked to build if they had access to land. And often these get built in this manner, very much a kind of colonial paradigm that gets perpetuated. This looks like the White House. I always tell this story. I met the contractor who was designing this, and I said, "Who's the architect?" And he said, "No. The client gave me a picture of the White House in Washington, D.C., and asked me to copy it, so I built it." So this becomes the paradigm by which we perpetuate. And this creates real polarity in these hinterlands, because these hinterlands are rural. The people here are poorer. Suddenly you have these fat cats from the city coming and building their mansions. And so that's a problem. And so we've done many of these projects, and we've tried in each of these to kind of address these contextual questions differently. So this first one was for a young couple in 2000. We did this 20 years, 20 years ago. And here, what we did was we sat with the client and we realized that they were going to spend out of 365 days, maybe 60 days here, some weekends. And so what we came up was with this diagram where what you see here is the living room of the house with movable furniture. Because I said, as when you're going to spend your weekend there, you'll probably sit in the veranda all the time. The roofs collect water. There are two taps that you see down here where anyone can come when they're not here to fill their buckets, because the villages around often don't have water. But here, this building actually becomes also a water collector and charges the well. And there's a caretaker. So it's not like it's open for Janta to come in, but the caretaker is from the local village. And when the clients are not there, the caretaker uses this veranda because the doors are all closed, the house is secured, but the veranda is this ambiguous space which becomes very private when the clients are there, but becomes almost semi-public when the clients are not there through the filter of the caretaker naturally. And he can use the water, he can use some of these facilities which otherwise lie kind of fallow. And of course, with these sorts of ambitions, it's not that you compromise the architecture, but you add an aspiration to it. In this case, the aspiration was to make some space that was a softer threshold that would allow this porosity, that would dissipate this polarity, which architecture otherwise establishes in these contexts. The second one we did, which you see sitting at the edge of a village, and the village will often grow and even encompass it. And so we said, how could we fragment the house in a way that when the village grew around it, in terms of scale, it fitted. It wasn't this big mansion that sat in the middle of a village. And we also added another research challenge to ourselves, which was that supposing this was a lower middle class person who wanted to build a house, could they build it incrementally? So we made the house in modules, and where the first module that you see on the top is really the living room, a courtyard, a dining, and a kitchen, very frugal, but small. But when it aggregates with the other modules, it makes the house look big. Otherwise, the house looks very, very modest. The second module is actually a lap pool with a study. This is for a very famous doctor. And a guest room and a toilet. And then the third module is the 3 bedrooms for the family. So when they are together, they can close the door here and they can open all the blinds and they feel they're in one big room. But if the client has other guests and not the family, that's number 8 that you see, they can also put the blinds down and everybody has flexibility. So it has this kind of flexible arrangement. But as an aggregation of all these 3 units, it becomes a mansion. But when you disaggregate or when you're in each one of these units, it's very humane and very small. And so that's how it sits in the landscape. And the village might grow around it, and the houses will be the same scale, there'll be same fragmentation, they won't be much larger. It has a base of local stone with these very simple monoslope roofs, and only just the windows have been finished in copper, just to exaggerate some preciousness. For every room, there's one window that becomes an element. And the lap pool, when you're in the lap pool through that slit window, you can see the landscape, but people can't see you swimming. And this was another very important thing for us, because often people try to replicate a Californian home in a very poor rural landscape, and it becomes a sign of ostentation. Whereas here, there's a kind of discretion. So the gardener, who you might hire from the village, is working here. The hedonistic kind of activities of the owners and the clients, which are urban, will be very discreet within the house, while yet not compromising its relationship to the landscape. The interiors are very simply finished with cement floors, the layers of courtyards, and all those beautiful things that we like doing with architecture. And this is how it becomes modular. This is how the views are framed, and the discretion of the lap pool is maintained. It's very simple finishes, but it aggregates to become a mansion. But every unit is very humane. And this is the bedroom wing, where you see the blinds are all discreetly hidden, but can be closed to create privacy, or it can create a big feeling of oneness and largeness as you go through it. The second project I'm showing you now is an institution. And Bharat asked me earlier where I graduated from. I studied at CEPT, and this is a building by Doshi, which is among the original buildings. And I'm an alum there, and I was very honored where about 5 years ago, I was asked to make an intervention, which would be the first non-Doshi building. So of course, it became very controversial, but we, got our act together and said, let's respond to this. And so we were given a site. Christopher Benninger made the master plan, and then we did 2 additions. We were given a site for a library, and we added a cafe, and we also finished the plaza and tied all the buildings up together, the plinths and all of that. So it kind of responds to it. It was a very difficult project because, again, here, the patron client were the Ahmedabad Education Society, which is a foundation. The user clients or the operational clients were the building committees, and the building committee had everyone who had been a senior of mine at CEPT. So it was very tough. And then the user clients were the students and the faculty. And so we did lots of presentations. We tried to create connections between these 3 aspects, which is where I kind of learned how I think to look at the client a little more complexly actually helps the building. We were asked to, the program required this library to be 6 stories high, which would have been highly problematic because, we didn't want to interfere with the scale of Doshi's buildings, because this is, a bit of modern heritage. And so we said we'll hold all the datum lines. We will not disturb the datum lines, although we'll do something that is new and more contemporary. And so what we landed up doing is doing a building that went 3 floors below the ground and 3 floors above the ground. So it was a very complex building to do, but that's how we felt it would be most appropriate. So it's a series of buildings nestled into each other, and you see there are 3 floors that go into the ground, and then there are 3 floors that are above. And it's 3 buildings because the outer skin is a performative skin, which helps modulate light and air and all of that. Then you have an inner box, which is made in gypsum board and things, which houses the reading rooms and things like that. And then within that, you have an inner building, which is the book stacks. Now, each of these three buildings have their own logic, which means the floor heights are different, the materials are different. And so you get three buildings sitting within and nestled within each other. And it does many things, because what it does is it allows each building to respond to what its functions are in terms of material and performance. What it also does is by having sectional differences, as you go down to a basement, you are getting slippages of floors, which means your eye always goes across on the diagonal. Otherwise, going down just like that, 3 floors into a basement would be very claustrophobic. So by doing these sorts of architectural moves, you create incredible porosity, visual porosity, which allows the experience of being within the ground much more pleasurable, let's say. And so that's what the section looks like. So you see the ground, you have an outer building, inner building, and then you have the book stacks within. And then you have these courtyards that are carved down into the ground. So they take light. So you have natural light that comes all the way down into the building, except the last level, which is pure archives and storage. And as you go up, the building gets much lighter in terms of light, because those are the reading spaces. And the lower areas are the meditative reading spaces for referencing, for quiet reading, not magazines, just books that you have to take out from the stack. And that's what it sort of looks like when it's, cut sectionally. So from the top, it is a concrete base, which picks up on the datums of the existing buildings, because they have this kind of concrete base. And the upper is in steel and plywood. And these are louvers that can open completely. So you see that building within now. And it creates this kind of porosity. But each of these panels can be adjusted differently depending on the quality of light and air that you would want within. And so here you see how the datums, that means the datum of the beam there picks up the datum of the beam here. And then what we did was, you see the plinth of the existing building, which just had mud coming up to it. So we exposed all of that, and we created a plinth for the whole campus, so that all the buildings on the campus actually sat on a common plinth and began to relate to each other. And that's how you see the different buildings here. You come in through these bridges, and you see that variation in the material. You see how it kind of relates in terms of the datums to the existing building. And here you see the courtyard that goes below. The ground floor is a very ambiguous open space that allows juries, it allows workshops, it allows exhibitions. And then the building is lined up perfectly with the axis of the old buildings by Doshi. So it was a way of respecting those buildings to create this axiality between the two studio spaces. And here you see the ground floor being used more formally, in this case for an exhibition. And there you see the bridge that brings you from the outer skin of the building to the inner skin. And now I'll take you lower down. So now we are going to go down to this level of the ground. And so here you see many things. You see the stacks inside, which is treated as a separate building that, it's a 4-story building that sits within the building. These are carrels that you see for PhD students. These are the bridges that connect the buildings. The color of the concrete gets lighter as you go below the earth, so that you have more reflective light reflection. So the upper concrete is this dark gray, it becomes very light gray and becomes much more white when you go below. And this is how it feels when you're in the carrels. That's the outer courtyard. These are the stacks. And these are only 8 feet high. So there, again, there's a big split. And then you can go out to the court if you want to speak, so that you don't disturb your other fellow students who are concentrating in the carrels. And that's how it feels, because the inner structure is only 8 feet clear heights, because that's what you need to reach a book. But this is what you see on the diagonal. So what you see on the top of the slide where the light is coming is the ground level. What you see in the middle here is that lower courtyard. And what you see here below is the floor even below. But because your eye can go on these diagonals, your views extend. And so you don't feel the claustrophobia that you would feel if you were in a basement. And this is just a video that takes you through, it'll just take you through the building. We used a drone to do this. And these are catwalks from where you can actually open and close the louvers. And here as you go down, I'm sorry, the videos is taking. Okay, I'll just forward it. Okay, anyway, it's just takes you through the section of the building. But let me just go to the next slide. So when you come down underground, this is what you feel. The concrete is lighter. It's just these three portals that make the structure. So there are no beams and columns. There are three portals. And then all the services are integrated in the book stack. So therefore, the surfaces are very clean and the portals are clear. So they create a kind of space in the center, which becomes a separate kind of conference room. But it's very minimal. And here it's very cool in some ways because it's a very hot climate. And when you go to the upper levels, it's of course much lighter. You see, the light, and you can adjust the louvers to close them. There are spaces outside which can be used for classes and for meeting without disturbing people inside. And then here, the louvers can close depending on which panel. Each panel is on one rod, so it's very easy to close it. There's a detail there for a harness, so someone can wear a harness and go. So it sort of has that safety. We've also made a manual which tells you how to adjust the building through the year. And the idea is students might learn from it in terms of passive cooling and all of that. At night, it begins to take on a different feeling in terms of its transparency. The base is articulated to become otlas and seats. So people have lunch, they sit there with their laptops, and you kind of get this reflective quality of seeing a world inside, which keeps changing depending on the way the sun is. So sometimes you see reflections, sometimes it becomes porous at night, and it's a kind of changing field. This next project I'm going to show you is a building in Hyderabad where, it was many questions because Hyderabad also is a hot, dry climate. This was a building for a high-tech company in Cyberabad, which is the high-tech zone. And it's an infrastructure company, and they wanted, a high-tech building. And that was the brief. We want to be like a global operator. They use technology. This is like a control room where every truck that works on their infrastructure projects has a camera fixed on it in real time. They can actually monitor the work. They can see efficiencies. And they wanted a glass block. They said, we have to look like a global corporation. And every glass block I saw in Hyderabad always had fishing nets because, they were going through the Andhra and, the separation of the Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. They were going through the separation of the states. So there were a lot of riots. So people would storm these buildings, and therefore they would put fishing nets to protect it. And I thought, my God, how crazy that these images of globalization, of impatient capital are so compelling that they overpower any sense. At that moment, we were very inspired by this little hut, which is actually, it's a water cooler. It's in Jaipur, and this guy works for the government or the association. And he puts his little mug out there and he's open for business. And he supplies people water. And this hut is cooled by evaporative cooling. There's no plastic cups, there's nothing. It's a lovely, very humane gesture. And we were just so inspired by this. And he keeps it just cool by keeping it through evaporative cooling. So we were so inspired by this that we said, we must actually do our building which picks up on these principles of evaporative cooling, because even the matkas, essentially the matkas, because they're not fired very high, they don't have a glaze, they are porous. So they allow evaporative cooling. And there's beauty in this gesture. And so what we did was we were inspired by this, and we came up with a building that would be a 5-story garden, but it would not be a green wall in the way people are doing this around the world, where you stick these pots of green and plastic on the wall surface, but rather it's a performative surface which is kept moist, and it allows the air to go through it to create evaporative cooling. And so this became a building with these facades as gardens. So instead of making these patterns with alico bond of different color, we said, let's make these patterns with flowers of different colors. And so even seasonally, the building will look different as people kind of approach it. And we tested this in a nursery. We did a lot of work to make sure that it would work. And then, of course, with the impatience of capital, they wanted the building ready in 12 months. And so we did that. We gave them the shell, they got the cows, they did all their puja. It was sanctified and they occupied it. While we asked them for 2 more years to make the facade. And we made the facade. It was handmade. It was made as a trellis that would look good, even if the plants didn't grow on it. And it was made in a very small handcrafted operation where, it was a small contractor. We made a mold, which was the expensive part of this. And it was about also experimenting, I believed, with handcrafting, but handcrafting with other more industrial materials rather than just wood and stone, which we fetishize and we make very romantic, which is important. I don't have anything against those materials, but here we took recycled alloys, we made these molds so the cost could be kept low. And these were very small panels that could be, hand ground. They had a texture. This is an anodizing tank. It's very light. It looks very heavy, but it's very, very light. It was designed like this. And then when they stacked, there were enough 8 or 10 panels. They could be put in a small van, taken to site, and 2 people could assemble it. And that took a while to do. But when it was done and the plant started growing, this misting system is only to cool the building. The plants get water through a hydroponic tray, which I'll show you in a second. But this can set the atmosphere. It can keep the building moist so that through evaporative cooling, it stays cool. The only areas that pop out are the conference rooms. Those are the commons where everyone comes so they get the views. The rest of the building is shielded. The water is recycled through a channel at the base. And the flowers grow seasonally. And of course, therefore, the facade changes. When it's misting, it feels like rain. So it's very soothing and very cooling. The gardeners who work on the facade, their presence, the shadows become the ornament in very simple ways. And they change. So you get this feeling of change through the day. And it cuts out a horrible world that surrounds the building. As you can see, it's a kind of banal landscape that we see everywhere that we go. And so that's how it sort of evolves. It becomes this woolly monster. If you give it a haircut and then it goes back, you have a hydroponic tray in the facade, which is where the plants grow from. They get kept moist through the misting system that allows the air to cool it. And that's how you see it. The base is a podium, which has parking, and it has, the administration, it has the reception, the security, all the services. But the podium then becomes a recreational garden, for people working there who are all quite young. And these are the different flowers, the lemon grass that forms on the podium. And of course, even sectionally, it's about how you take the hot air out. It responds to the program. So what you see as the salad, the cheese and the sandwich is the tendering department and accounts, which needed privacy. The rest are much more social and open and have double heights and stairs connecting them. And you have a conference room, you have gymnasiums. Now, we didn't get a LEED certificate. Now we have Greha, which will do this, but passive cooling and things wasn't accounted for. This guy who's right next to us, which is just essentially a glass and alicobond box, got a LEED certificate because they used all the sealants and they used air conditioning that was efficient. We didn't have any of that. So we are now trying to monitor this to see what we can learn from it. But my point is only this, that paradigms, this whole leads, and it's also, you have to be cautious because it's also a green industry that is perpetuating standards, right? And I think that's important, but I think we have to also think innovatively. And now with the GREA standards and all, they would be more sympathetic to a building like this perhaps. But for me, to be quite transparent and honest, this was an intuitive leap, meaning one didn't sit down with a paper and calculate what the plants would do, how much water would we need. We just felt intuitively this was the right thing to do. We worked on it sensibly. We had consultants, but our aspiration wasn't to get a LEED certificate. Our aspiration was to make a good building that might also perform and be a nice atmosphere for people to work in. So I come back to this image, and this is what, I now call this a soft threshold. That is a threshold on which the gardeners can work. And what's interesting, Sanjay Prakash, who's a good friend and a authority on green buildings, said to me, you've really created green jobs, because he said here the lowest paid workers in this building are the ones that are most responsible for the identity of the building and its architecture, because if the facade isn't green, the building fails. And so suddenly they have dignity, and they are looked at with great empathy, and they get to know each other, and that is truly what has happened. And there are blinds on all these windows, but no one puts those blinds down. They wave to each other. They've got to know each other. There is a softening of this threshold that happens otherwise between economic groups in all our societies in very, very severe ways. And yeah, this is not a staged photo. If it was a staged photo, I would have moved all the wires and the newspapers. But this is a kind of form of coexistence between people who work at the higher level and people who work at the lower level. And in some ways, the people who work at the lower level are the heroes of the building because they're the ones responsible for the building. This is a video we made just last year in the summer. I went back to the building after it was 10 or 12, 13 years or 14 years old, just to see how things were going. And we kind of made this video, which is, I don't, for some reason, the videos are not working very well. Anyway, um, maybe I'll just skip it. But this just shows how the green is doing now. It's become, very full and successful. And so, it's nice. And that's how the building sits in the landscape. This was a garden, which was a reserved garden, public space, which these clients sponsored. So we put the trees in and all of that. So now the building almost looks like it's growing out of that garden. But it just happens to be sitting at the edge of the designated public space for this area. Uh, Now I'm just going to go to the last project, and actually this relationship, as I was saying, of the poorest and the people on the higher end of the hierarchy working together takes on a very interesting dimension when you get to government projects, you get to low-cost housing. And I want to just read as a preface something that Pratap Bhanu Mehta wrote about wicked problems and about really our context, in the context of also inequity. Pratap Bhanu Mehta was the chancellor of Ashoka University. He's now a professor there, also used to be at Harvard University, a brilliant mind. And I'm just going to quote him. And he said, in a society riven by deep inequality, there's not even the minimal basis for mutual concern, where social distance makes human beings almost a different species in each other's eyes. Why would you expect anything else? Why would a contractor care if one of his construction workers used his hands rather than a brush to apply a dangerous chemical? The more inequality there is, it is harder to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. It has to be admitted that even the most well-meaning and sensitive find it hard to imagine what the suffocation, darkness, and sheer physical suffering of being at the bottom of a social hierarchy might really be like. The very thing you would expect to instigate questions of justice makes it even hard to raise them. And this is very important because I think all of us as architects have this problem when we are faced with projects which involve the poor, involve the marginalized, etc. And so I'm going to share with you a project where I think we dealt with some of these issues, and only in reflection that one actually understood them and framed them in the way that Pratap Bhanu Mehta has so much more lucidly done than I can ever. And so this was a project for mahouts and elephants in Rajasthan, in a desert climate where elephants shouldn't be there because they're tropical beings. That's why they don't look so healthy. You can see how their skin is, etc. And the Mahout community is largely a Muslim community, so they are a minority in a state like Rajasthan, and they're very poor. They get 5,000-6,000 rupees a month, which is really little to support a family and also look after an elephant, which is not difficult. Of course, the food for the elephant comes from the owner of the elephant. And elephants became popular, through American tourists. This is from the New York Times magazine advertisement of going to Jaipur to feel like a Maharaja for a day. They actually take tourists up and down. They get painted. This is very toxic for their skin. They can't be washed because there's no water. It's a desert climate. And so there are many problems. That's the housing the government gave them. And there were many animal rights activists who revolted. And so they had a competition. This was the site for the competition. The land had been dug out by sand quarrying contractors. We won this competition and we were appointed to do it. And we made water the central protagonist in this. We said, unless you have water, unless you can make the landscape in some way even if it can't be a tropical landscape, but it's a little more habitable. It's more important in this case than the architecture. This was very hard to do because, of course, for us trained as architects, architecture becomes central. But if you gave this problem to, Bharat Sharma, for example, he would pick it up the way I'm now going to show you it's been picked up, because it comes from a landscape sensibility where you privilege landscape. We often design buildings, design cities, and then keep a little residual space for landscape. But I mean, I think the new world is showing us that we have to actually design the landscape first, and buildings and the man occupied things, the human occupied things should come in the interstitial space. So we have to kind of reverse this paradigm. And for us, this project was a little bit about trying to do that, which was to design the landscape through these check dams, small little dams, water bodies, planting trees, what species we would use, so that we could create on this land, which had some memories of where the water trickles, even the few inches that comes into Rajasthan, and capturing that in an intelligent way, and then putting the architecture in the interstitial spaces. And that's the final site plan we came up with, which got partly implemented and partly not. And this is the transformation. When we started there in 2007, that's the hill, and that's what the site looked like. And 3 years later, by digging up these water body areas and letting it just go for 3 monsoons, that's the transformation. And that's the same hill that you see from a slightly different point. And then now, 10 years later, it's sort of actually, you can see how much the trees have grown. But we didn't also compromise the architecture. We looked at the architecture. We broke away from the row housing that they wanted. It's 250 square feet for LIG, low income housing. What we did was we added a courtyard for every house. We had a courtyard for 3 houses to share. All the tricks we learn in South Asia to extend space, open to sky spaces, how the elephants could be housed there. And so we tried to make also an architecture where the food could be stored on these higher roofs, which would allow ventilation and insulation, and and how elephants, what would be the right size, to develop a kind of handbook metrics for what might work for elephants and what might not. And that's what we came up with. Finally, you see Amber Palace in the background, which is where the elephants work. And then of course every cluster is different. These houses look very raw because they hadn't yet been allocated. Now they're beginning to allocate this 12 years later. And in Rajasthan, people, the first thing they do is they paint their houses, and they're doing beautiful things. And every cluster, of course, pans out differently depending on the group that occupies it. And some have become very lush because even though the middle class people in Jaipur have to get water tankers for their gardens, these guys have enough water. So they have lawns and they have trees and they sell flowers. They've moved out into the courtyard to make for the kitchen, so they get an extra room. And life corrodes architecture, and in housing, life really corrodes housing. Now the goats have moved in, the trees have grown. There's a whole ecology there, which, as an architect now, you don't even have control of, but it's good because it's an armature that lets life, in a sense, thrive. And the different clusters work out differently because the community that is living there gets along well. There you see the elephant. We've kept these windows so the elephant can also see these courtyards. The children can caress the elephant without actually going in there, because sometimes it's not, it's safe. And that is the kind of transformation, the before and after from the same spot. The dish antennas have arrived, so it means life is really sort of taking over. And what they do is they really go up and down these ramparts, and they go get rogue because it is very hot. It's a very difficult task. You see how their skins discolor because of the toxicity. They walk to work in these sort of hot climates on this tarmac, which really burns their feet. But now because we have provided the water bodies, we didn't realize this, but what the water bodies also did, they created a bonding between the mahouts and the elephants. And that was something that was unanticipated. We were doing the water for the landscape, but then we realized that the process of the mahout bathing the elephant is where the bonding actually happens. And they play with their mouths, like this guy is going to now, splash his mahout with water, and keep themselves cool. And this was an image we took in the peak of summer, and that's why the water is so low. But in the monsoon, of course, it fills up. This is kikar, which is a local species. And then also we made these pavilions because elephants have to be social. And the Mahout's children used it as an opportunity and started a company called Elephantastic, and they, charge tourists 100, 500 rupees to feed the elephant or to have a bath with the elephant. And so that got converted into a kind of economic activity. This was just a mapping we did where we showed how what you see in red is our office, which stayed constant through the 12 years of the project. The political parties, which you see at the bottom, kept changing. The operational client, so that's the patron client, the operational client kept changing. It started with the Amber Development Authority, then the tourism the department took it over, then the tourism gave it to the forest department, the forest department gave it to back to tourism. So we had shifting operational clients, we had a constant user client, and we had a shifting patron client. And so this is where I think it really became clear to us that to really be able to make a project successful, we become the bridge. That is our agency, and we have to recognize that agency because we often resist it. But if we don't recognize that agency, I think we don't create these bridges between different components of the client. And again, these are just before and after images. You see, it's yet under progress. We are not involved. They're following drawings. They're not following drawings. We made a gateway which just sort of defines it, called Hathi Gaon. And there's this kind of infrastructure we had to put in there. That's the site plan. We added a small guest house, which wasn't part of the program, but we can convince the chief minister it would actually be a good thing. 4 rooms and a small dining facility, which they could give to scholars, experts, conservationists, animal rights activists, but even tourists to make money. And that's how it sits. It's a very low-key structure. It's very discreet. You go into a courtyard, and in the courtyard, it's khatiyas and basic stuff, and very minimally finished. And these are the wives of the Mahout. They run the thing, they cook, clean, and they're the ones who actually get the income from this, which was part of the need. And now that they started allocating the houses, they're painting the houses. And what I was surprised about was I thought they'd paint elephants like in Shekhawati and beautiful things, but they were painting birds. And you can see the saplings, about 5,000-6,000 trees were planted. And what the occupants finally said to me was, they said, no, actually what has happened is because of the water and the trees, the birds that are coming here are very unusual. And so bird lovers are coming here more than elephant lovers. Now that was an unintended consequence. So they're beginning to paint their houses with birds. And the lowest parts of the site, of course, are the greenest. This is a Photoshop image, but this was our aspiration, to create a sense of wetness, of humidity, of vegetation, because we felt that would be the right habitat for them. And there was, again, some old buildings there, which we renovated into a school for the children of the Mahouts, because really it's the next generation that's important. So with that, I've kind of finished my projects. I'm going to just take 2 minutes to tell you, because Biresh mentioned the book. But all this has been captured in this book, among many other things, because I haven't touched upon, say, conservation here. And we've also got a large practice in conservation. So, and this book is very much text, it's very text heavy. I start by saying this is not a monograph, because it's actually a very text heavy book. And this is an attempt to really theorize the reflection. That is, how can one create a theory out of what we are doing in South Asia? And what does all this mean? What does making a farmhouse for someone mean? And what are the contextual problems we should look at? We can't just go by the theory that comes out of the developed West. And so this is a section, for example, on conservation, where it's theorized in a way. What does new mean? What does cultural significance mean in societies like ours, where time is also cyclic and not kind of linear? So in a sense that it's really a book that is very much about reflection and theorizing. And that's why I kind of start the book by saying this is not a monograph, rather it's a reflection of practice. And like I said, it is about connecting what has happened in South Asia, what had happened, what is happening, what might happen. And the book is broken in a way as even looking at the architecture of the interior, because interior is often the crucible where all of us start our practices, and we can take it seriously. And we don't, there's a difference between the architecture of the interior and interior decoration or design. And between the rural and the urban, this dichotomy that we are all struggling with. the notion of constructing significance, what that means for conservation, and then this notion of mediating the local and the global, how we can take global programs like corporate offices, IT centers, and localize them, make them more responsible and accountable to the locality. And how can we take very local programs, which might have to do like the Elephant Village, and make their lessons resonate globally in terms of ecology, landscape, etc. This is rather than caricaturing them to make them local, right? So these are the kinds of ways that I believe this sort of simplistic binary understanding of the world is synthesized into creating third options, third spaces, which resonate much more broadly. And then I end it with a large essay, which is where I attribute the context as the generator of the practice, because we are what it is. We are bound by geography. We learn from our location. Or all of you practicing in Kathmandu, you have a particular way of doing it versus practicing versus what I would have from Mumbai. If we really look hard and see how those values are formed by the context, I think it becomes very critical. And so that's what the book looks like. And Biresh mentioned it, so I thought I would just end by sharing that with you. So thank you very much for being so patient and listening to me. And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Grace? Grace?
Yeah, yeah. Uh, yeah. Yeah. So, thank you very much, Rahul, for that, wonderful lecture. I mean, taking us through this very inspiring set of projects that you have undertaken, and also sort of very illuminating to hear about the approaches and methods and the possibilities that comes out of these projects. I mean, the way you handled it and the way you've taken them through to the final outcomes. And I think it really highlights the challenges on that we face here in South Asia on the production of the contemporary built environment that's happening, and I mean there's the enormous challenges, and but then with the challenges also we also there are many possibilities and opportunities that they offer for the architect here to engage in many diverse ways, I think, and I think that really comes across very clearly and very, very lucidly in your discussion. So, thank you very much for that. We will take some questions, uh, but
I see.
yes,
I see. I see one question from Arun Dev Pant. I'm happy
yes,
to answer that if you like me to do that.
yes, please, yeah. So,
Okay. So,
uh,
Arun, thank you very much for that question. And it's a very good question, and I'll just read out his question for those who might not be have connected, which is: exposed brick buildings without protective overhang can be especially problematic over time, and could this be a factor for the IIM debate? Is that the reason that you decided not to incorporate brickwork in the library building at SEPT? So this is a very, very good question. So let me just start by saying, yes, I think you're right. It's interesting that, even now, say, for example, in Goa, in many parts of India, we use exposed laterite, for example, or we use exposed brick. Now, I mean, if you look historically, if the climate was, good for brick, which is a hotter, drier climate, brick can last for long. But if the climate is not good for brick in terms of the expansive differences in temperature or heavy rainfall, like in Mumbai, it would be ridiculous to do an exposed brick building. I think that becomes a big factor. In the case of IIM, I mean, I think it's more complicated. I think where it also has to do with maintenance, which means if you maintain it by rubbing the brick, then you've got the crust removed and therefore the brick pits or I think in the case of IM, where reinforcement bars were introduced in the flat slabs, in the flat arches, created to an expansiveness which, with the corrosion of the steel, which led to that brick being damaged. So I would say that I would say you can't, we shouldn't blame the brick completely, uh, uh, but I think how we look after the brick and how we use the brick and its formulation becomes very important. Coming to SEPT, why we didn't use brick, there was a lot of pressure, I can assure you that, and this became a very heated debate. There were WhatsApp groups. There were, I mean, I just had to, if I had to do the building, I had to just ignore all those discussions. But later I looked at them and I realized that there was a big discussion and that people felt that I should be completely, responsive to the campus and only use exposed brick and exposed concrete like in the old buildings. And so my argument was different. My argument was that actually the scale for me was more important. The broad palette of textures was more important. But I felt very strongly that in the way these brick and concrete buildings had taught 2 or 3 generations about architecture, it was also our responsibility with new materials coming in, with steel, with glass, with plywood, with all of this coming in. Can we also demonstrate ways that it can be used? So I challenged myself with, or we challenged ourselves with taking on newer materials, both for a cost efficiency, but also for me from the perspective of the life cycle of materials, which is why what at least my research has taught me. So for me, for example, I realized that the base of the SEPT building in the library and what goes under the ground, we have to have there as an armature for a long time, because that's a big investment in terms of creating a shell. And therefore that was done in concrete. It was done with the highest quality concrete with the greatest care, etc. But then what goes above it is in steel and louvers. Maybe there's a bet. We couldn't afford wood. We couldn't afford other materials. We used plywood with a monocoat to finish it, to weather it. But 10 years later, they might have a better material and they can shift it, because the life cycle of that plywood is 10 or 12 years. So therefore, it's justifiable to do that. Or that inner building, which is protected, which is in gypsum board, they might change the frame of that in 20 years. And that's justifiable because that's the life cycle of that material. And so I think for us to see buildings and building components, and this is true for any building, if you look at conservation, the act of conservation, anyone who does conservation, all the problems in a building, in a historic building, lie where two materials meet that have completely different life cycles, right? So when wood goes into stone, the stone can stay for 600 years, but the wood after 200 years has problems, 150 years, right? So how do we get more mindful of the life cycles of materials? And for me, the SEPT building was really about differentiating materials of different life cycles and using them strategically to create an architectural expression, but also to allow future generations to be able to repair, change those buildings without compromising the overall integrity. So in a sense, you asked your question about brick, and brick, I think for me, the main thing is maintenance and the sensitivity with which it's originally constructed. But the SEPT building, these were the reasons why one responded in this way. There's a question from Renz Irving. Hello, may I ask, with your design inspiration and strategies, how will you apply it in a Catholic church? Oh gosh, I don't know. I haven't had the opportunity to design a Catholic church, so I don't know. But what I can say to you is I'll make a little bit of a deviation, which is the only thinking that I've done about this. Uh, so there are many ways you can look at the Catholic Church, right? And well, let me answer this in 2 ways. I'm going to answer this first from a kind of slightly theoretical perspective, which is, J.B. Jackson, who, I'm sure Bharat and Beresh know about. He wrote the building,
Yeah,
book called
yeah,
Necessity of Ruin. And he talked about, or he quoted a geographer or a sociologist, I can't remember, where he talked about how you know well, he said how younger religions, and he talked about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were preoccupied by the moment and the conditions of the covenant between man and the Almighty, right? And that moment of that covenant between all man and the Almighty through the Son of God or whatever is what gave expression to their religious structures. So, for example, the church became, the cruciform became symbolic, the altar, the way it was set up. These were symbolic, and architecture lent itself very well to that kind of symbolism. And he argued that more ancient cultures and societies, and he talked about Hinduism, but I would extend that even to the Aboriginal people in Australia or tribal cultures, where the preoccupation is not with that covenant, because that covenant gets manifest and expressed in many different ways. But Hinduism, for example, is concerned with the original moments of creation, right? And that's why the linga in a temple is the object that stays constant. The temple gets rebuilt, the shell of the temple gets painted, rebuilt, repaired without any self-consciousness almost. In fact, it's problematic when you're trying to conserve it because, as conservationists, you want it to be static, but actually in that imagination, it's that original moment, or, the temple tank with a thumb in the center, which symbolizes the churning of the ocean. It's symbolism that will stay constant, but the temples around the tank will be repaired, transformed with every generation. And so I think one has to recognize these kinds of differences, perhaps, if one has to. Then there's a question of Catholicism in different geographies, right? I mean, Catholicism, I recently saw the most wonderful exhibition, which was happened to be in Goa in a festival, which were miniature paintings that reinterpreted Christ in, in the Asian context. And they were beautiful paintings of the Last Supper, which was in a courtyard with the apostles all sitting on the ground around Jesus having a meal, right? So it's also Catholicism and its geographic location. And that's what, I mean, now that you've asked about a Catholic church, I would say that was what was, in my view, brilliant about Charles Correa's church in Mumbai, where he kind of was inspired by the open to sky spaces. He met all the requirements of Catholicism and its rituals, but reinterpreted the idea of the church in a planar perspective, being inspired by movement through courtyards and temples and the disaggregation of the different moments of the ritual within the Catholic dispensation of the use of a church, right? So that was a completely different. So I mean, I think that answer, I think it would be a mistake to even think of the church as a universal solution. It's just that the paradigm that situates itself in Europe finally is the one that has taken the greatest traction, but that's a question we should be asking. So, one can respond to your questions in many different ways, but it's a very good question, is what I'll say. I'm sorry if I haven't been more precise and all of that. Bharat, you had your hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I ask you something, Rahul?
Sure.
Yeah, Rahul, it was excellent presentation, really very from Allahabad to, Kumbh to, you know, all the Bad, Hyderabad and Ahmedabad, and then to Rajasthan, very interesting journey, architectural journey. But having said, you started in a rather heavy note talking about context and formal city, informal city, and and then economic dimensions. And then you talked about kinetic city also, and somewhere you talked about the ephemeral urbanism also. I think you didn't have much time to really elaborate on that. I would have loved to listen to you. But first of all, let me start with my salute to Professor Edward Seckler, who used to love this country in context of conservation and all. And then I could see him in your presentation. I could see, Barley Mars in landscape of Rio for the have-nots, in the sea area, how he had designed the landscape, and I was seeing so many people around this, But my question goes to you. It is a bit off-beat question. We had this global epidemic happening, isn't it? COVID, in that context, w- during our earthquake, we had, I call them Boston pundits. We had a lot of Americans architects and the British and French architects coming, and they were telling us that, you know, I, in fact, I wasn't in that presentation, but I heard it later on that brickwork, timber, and the thatch should be banned, and mud mortar should be banned in Nepal to take care of the earthquake. I said, my God, earthquake doesn't come once, it comes, and then the society knows how to rise up. So who the hell you are to tell us that, you could use in this? I call them Boston pundits. I don't know to what extent you are, in fact, in Boston area, but nonetheless, don't take it otherwise. So
Yeah.
how do you say that with the COVID and the new normal situation? You have talked about paradigm shift, and somewhere, I could, uh, you were talking about the transformation of space also. A very, very lucid manner, I was seeing Habrakan, tell you frankly, when you're
Yes,
talking
yes.
about Professor Habrakan, when you are presenting on the transformation of space. So this COVID situation, do you think that there has to be a paradigm shift on the part of the architects to address to this kind of epidemic, which will come in future also, and in the post COVID situation or new normal situation, what should be our, really task to uh, take care of the society uh, in context of equity and from all aspects? Sorry, I asked you a long question.
Yeah, no, no. I mean, look, I mean, I think if we had good planning, many of these things get sorted out automatically. I think the pandemic highlights these structural problems in our society even more starkly, and they become wake-up calls. And pandemics historically in the world have done that, right? Cities have expanded, cities have reworked their infrastructure, cities have created forms of equity, cities have invested in social infrastructure. When I say social infrastructure, I mean health infrastructure. So I mean, I think what extreme conditions or crises do is they highlight for us as society these kinds of structural problems that exist in society. And if in that condition we don't recognize it, then I think we're just going to be losers, in the sense we are going to be affected, right? So I mean, I think at best I can say is that this is a good moment to articulate and reflect those structural differences, whether it has to do with inequities, which will then result in certain kinds of environments, and governments have to wake up to it. And this is where I think, for us as architects, we must recognize that agency. I mean, if society invests in us tremendously to imagine better spatial possibilities or better space organizations that will help society live better, right? Whether it's from a health perspective, or it's from a sociability perspective, or it's from a cultural perspective. And I think that we need to recognize more and more. And that's why for me the two or three critical things which I tried to highlight were that we have to become very aware that our spheres of concern find ways that we can influence things. They're not just concerns that we sit with friends over a glass of wine and we discuss these problems, but that we can actually act upon them. And I think one way of acting upon them is actually getting engaged much more in what I was calling the mainstream of architecture, or not taking refuge on the margins, which is important, but that's not an end in itself, right? And therefore, in order to do that, we have to understand the client better, we have to understand society better, we have to understand the context we work in better, much more rigorously. We have to be committed to understanding it and committed to acting on it in our projects. Otherwise we go into a very comfortable space, and this perpetuates all these problems that you're talking about. And I think we have to take more responsibility, basically. And I think, and I'm, and this is where institutions play a big role. And somebody also has asked a question, and this is sort of related to what you're saying, is what major elements you suggest for planning new cities in existing rural settlements. And that's it's a very difficult question, architect Basu Podel, is that right? Yeah. And actually the new book I'm doing, which will be out in 6 months, is called Becoming Urban. And it's actually arguing that even the rural urban is not even a legitimate way, that it's again a binary that we should get rid of, because this urban rural dichotomy it's gone. There is nothing like that left any longer. I would argue, yes, of course, there's some villages that are more isolated, and therefore, but now the movement of people, the movement of technology, the connectivity, there's going to be nothing like a rural and an urban. They're going to be things of different densities, of different scales. I think that's much more productive for us to get into, because their different issues can be addressed at different scales. And so therefore we've got to figure out what those issues are, and how we sort of, we address them. Because I mean, I think we are basically, Bharat, in all your questions is embedded the super question, which is what is the role of the architect in the future? And how can we, given all these problems, actually play a productive role? Otherwise, we will be marginalized in society very quickly, because there will be other professionals who will make that decision. And I don't mean this from a commercial perspective. I just mean this from the perspective of the importance of spatial arrangements in ways which society actually operates, which is critical. And the pandemic has raised a whole range of those questions, including what is the urban and the rural.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah,
Rao. Thank you very much.
do we have time left for another question, or?
I'm okay. I'm fine.
Yeah, I mean, this basically, this is a, wanted to ask you regarding what you started off your talk with, beginning about, the alternative ways of looking at practice here in South Asia, compared to what conventionally has been accepted, as professional architect practice elsewhere. And here, like, I feel like here in Kathmandu, Nepal, or, even, I mean, in Indian cities, the conventional practice is today is really informed by the past 150 years of development of architecture in the West, and, sitting here in Kathmandu, when I look at that development, I see it in basically two historical phases. One is, from the turn of the century, through the between the wars, the two big wars, and post-war construction, you had all these major transformative, events in even in Europe, and the architects, in many ways, were responding to those major transformations, city growths and housing, etc. The post-war reconstruction, and they had different kind of values, and compared, in contrast, the architecture coming out of the West, you see today, where, I mean, this is much more stable times, and in a way, it's, times of prosperity there. You see the new architecture, it seems to be more of, tending towards being like high art, or even like, monumental billboards, and you have a lot of very advanced technological resolutions, which seem like beyond our reach, beyond our reach. And yet, because the way we are inundated with this media today about architecture, through the digital media as well, printed media, somehow is so much, it's sort of, it really, I think, affects in a big way the way the architects and evolve in this part of the world. The main references seem to be these developments which actually are beyond our reach in terms of construction, in terms of design resolutions. So given your own practice, long practice here in Bombay and also in outside India, in other parts of the world, and how, what sort of a lens we need to, what kind of lens we need to use to look at these events, which have had a very strong, influence on the way we understand architectural practice today, uh, so that, we may be able to position our own future architectural sort of practice in ways that you were describing earlier in your lecture.
So I mean, again, these are all questions we could spend an hour discussing, and actually one could formulate a whole lecture around the question you asked, Biresh, or one that Bharat asked before this, or even the previous ones. And but the way I would answer that is, again, I think it's linked a little bit to what I was sort of trying to highlight about how we have to nuance our understanding of the client, and therefore then how we engage with that process. And so these are different models of practice. And so, I mean, for me, for example, I think what Laurie Baker showed us in India was a different model of practice, where the mode of instruction is different, where the aspiration of the client is understood in a different way. Therefore, the way the makers of the architecture, which are the people who build, are engaged in a different way. The mode of instruction and relationships are completely different. I think that has to get. I mean, they look at Akshardham and all that was built in India. That didn't have an architect involved. I mean, it
mm,
was just many master craftsmen and logistics people who coordinate the components coming in. It's a whole different way of making architecture. And so I think in each context, there are different ways. I mean, I think what is overwhelming to see in the West comes out of a particular kind of building construction industry. It comes out of a particular kind of interface between digital technologies and the building
exactly.
construction industry and the aspiration of the client, and the fact that unfortunately, and I'm highlighting unfortunately, that architecture has become very much an autonomous object in those societies, whereas in our societies, I mean, the autonomy of architecture we don't have the luxury to afford that. Architecture must do many things simultaneously, must allow different parts of society to relate to it differently. Sometimes it's built incrementally. Sometimes it has to be built using interfaces. That's why we all make elaborate drawings, but finally we have to sit at site and make people understand what the drawings mean. So there are a lot of broken parts. If we just apply the Western paradigm of practice, then there are so many disjunctures that they become hard to resolve, and that we then attribute to the fact that, oh my god, we couldn't, it's very hard to finish a building very well in India, for example. We say that because there's too many broken bits in that supply chain. And So we have to find the right paradigms. Now, having said that, I also believe, and some people dedicate themselves. Laurie Baker dedicated himself to a part of society, which actually is not right. He did some for poorer people, he did some for very rich middle class people who wanted to retire in a Laurie Baker house. But he demonstrated one way of doing things. There are many offices in Mumbai, Hafiz Contractor and things, that demonstrate another way of doing things, right? My argument actually would be that I think we have to learn to work across those modes, which means, especially in South Asia, which means there are certain projects that you would actually operate like Laurie Baker, where with very minimal instructions, the interface is actually face to face on the site with the craftsman, right? Then there are certain kinds of projects that you can interface for a corporation in a completely different way. We have to be very nimble, I think, in South Asia to do that. And that is what will help us make the transition. Because if many of us do those models of practice simultaneously, we'll be able to weave new systems into place. What we tend to do is we tend to occupy one or the other world. We either try to become the barefoot architect and all we want to do is work with
Yeah.
mud and work with the craftsman directly, and we fetishize that. Or we want to be this super big firm that tries to imitate SOM or something, right? And we go there, and then there are 4 or 5 little spots in between, which are combinations. But my argument is we shouldn't feel trapped by that, because I think the mode of practice is also dependent on the client and the mode of and the nature of what you're trying to deliver. You know, so I think we have to, and it's tough. That means much more work, but I think that's the flexibility I believe we should be aspiring to.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I think as there are no more questions that I see on the board there.
Yeah.
Uh,
All
uh,
I would, Birish, all I would want to just say 2 things, if you don't mind, before you close it. One is I want to, of course, thank all of you, Bharat, Abhishek, Archana, Anju, everyone who's on it, Deepak, and of course, Sona, for even inviting me to do this. Enjoyed this immensely. And the second thing I wanted to say was that I hope this doesn't mean that one day we won't meet in Kathmandu, which will be really the right way to carry on all these conversations over dinner after the lecture and walking the streets of Kathmandu with all you friends. And I hope that will happen sometime in the future. So thank you very much. And I hand it over to you, Biresh.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, I hope that happens sooner than later, and you've been here before, so,
Yes.
it'll be, great to have you back again.
Vires, could I have a very sharp query,
Yes,
a
yes,
small one?
yes, please.
Uh, Rahul, last time we had Arcasia meeting here, and South Korea was a keynote speaker, and the theme of the conference was spiritualism in architecture, which was proposed by our very learned professor Sudarshan Raj Tiwari. And in fact, South Korea didn't touch on that. And when I asked him that, why didn't you touch on it? Then he said that it's a very difficult and very thoughtful kind of theme that I wasn't prepared for that. So, what is your view about spiritualism in architecture? Is it something to be sought for, or you just ignore it? It's not something to do with religion. It's something else.
Yeah, it is clearly a difficult one, but yes, of course. And I mean, I think I think we have to look for it in life. Architecture can help us manifest it, and absolutely. And now where, in fact, there's some. I just came across some very interesting books on the subject. And I mean, I think the question about Catholicism and how would one do a church. I mean, I think religious buildings allow for that spiritualism to be evoked through the architecture. Whether it's about looking up at light in a particular way, it evokes these sort of deep-seated, emotional, intuitive kind of aspects in our minds and our lives, which have to do with spiritualism, which is, at the deepest level, the spirit of the place of our lives. And architecture, I think, is an instrument that can facilitate that through spaces of meditation, through ways light changes. Light is something that does evoke something very deep down. And as science is showing us, when we look at images of the cosmos and what we see, and I mean, light is, of course, something that is life, no? And so, I mean, I think there are many intersections that it makes with architecture. And then, of course, this is also a very individual experience in terms of what feels spiritual, what is spiritualism. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a much broader, more philosophical question. And architecture, I believe, is an instrument that can help facilitate the spaces which provoke us to think or inspire us to think in particular ways, And landscapes too, by the way. I mean, in fact, landscapes immensely because they're very important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rahul, for this wonderful lecture and this wonderful evening for us. I hope it wasn't too early for you in the morning there. Uh, so thank you very much, and we look forward to further engagements in the future. And now I'd like to request Anju Malla to close the meeting and.
Okay. Thank you, Virish sir. It's really been a very great privilege for SONA to host you, sir.
Thank you.
We've been like, mesmerized, spellbound listening to you. And this could go on throughout the night, even like it could go on for hours. And we really look forward to hearing more from you on the Kumbh Mela thing. Also, you were talking about the notion of permanence. Sounds very interesting, and we would really like to hear more on it. And I would like to request Biresh sir to again coordinate another webinar, maybe on that topic itself. So we've learned a lot. I felt like a student, listening to your session. And we have so many of our SONA members also listening in. So hopefully all of us must have learned a lot from this session. And we look forward to, different ways to finding solutions. The way you talked about understanding the client, the dynamics of our cities in South Asia, that was really very interesting. It's opened up new points for us to ponder on in the future. I would also like to thank Biresh sir for initiating this and making it really happen. It's a really big milestone for SONA. I would also like to thank Architect Bharat Sharma, who is the chair of our education committee, all the SONA members who have joined us today, the attendees, the panelists, and many more who have also joined us via Facebook also. Thank you very much, sir. And we really look forward to hosting you someday in Kathmandu for real. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Namaste.